Today I want to talk about granny squares and how to sew them together. So you can create one granny square, a very large one to create a blanket, or you can use the granny square as sort of a block as you would on a quilt, and then at the end stitch the blocks together. And that's what I've done here. I've created two granny squares and I've crocheted them together, which is my favorite way to join granny squares. Because most of the time, if you're learning crochet or if you're a crocheter or a yarn person, you don't often want to pick up a needle and stitch things together. It's kind of more fun to just do what we do and crochet things together. So here's what it looks like on the right side of the work, which is sort of the front, the part that everybody sees. And then here's what it looks like on the wrong side, which I also love because it creates, crocheting the squares together creates this sort of ridge or like a window pane when everything's all put together. It just looks really lovely on both sides of the blanket. I think it's really pretty. Okay, so let's get to how we dang do this. Okay, so we're going to join together that square with this square. They're gonna get married. Marriage. Okay, so what you need for this project is this either coordinating yarn or matching yarn, whatever you want to use. I'm going to use matching yarn because that's how I roll. And you need a crochet hook. One in a similar size to what you created the granny squares with is fine. It actually doesn't matter a whole heck of a lot. Just something that's going to correspond nicely to the yarn that you want to use for this. All right, so the first thing that you want to make sure of is that you want the right sides of your squares facing together. And with the very first few squares of a granny square blanket or garment or whatever you're creating, it doesn't so much matter what the right sides are. I don't think it does. But once you have some connected, you want all of the window panes, the sort of seam, to be on the same side of the blanket or the garment or whatever it is you're making. Okay, so the key to do that is just to make sure your right sides are together. Okay, and then we're going to sort of turn it to the side and we're going to just look at this for a second. So you can see each stitch in the granny square here along the edges. That's great. That's going to help us because what we want to do, ideally, is to sort of line these up because we're going to be crocheting through them and we're going to be slip stitching all of those stitches together to create that little ridge there. Okay, so the very first thing that we want to do after we get our yarn all ready is locate that chain stitch that we use to make our corners in our granny square. And in this case, ours is here. So we're going to put our crochet hook through there. And what that looks like is you want the two little loops on the top, just like that. And then we're going to locate our next loop here. Hey, sass me. And we skewer that onto our crochet hook as well. Okay, so we have our corner stitches here. We're starting from ground zero, so we know our corners are nice and lined up. And we're going to take our working yarn, and you can either do a slip stitch here or you can just load it onto your hook this way. We're going to pull it through those stitches. Stitch, please. So we have our loop. We're going to move our tail out of the way. Okay, one loop, great. Now we have to find the next loop coming this way to the left. So that would be this guy. See him? So I'm going to put my hook through him. And then our next stitch here, you can tell kind of by using your working yarn where it is. So that's stitch 1 and that's stitch 2. We want stitch number 2. So we're going to put our hook through there. We're going to grab our working yarn, pull it through those stitches. Now we have 2 stitches on the hook. We're just going to grab that first loop and pull it through the second one on our hook. That is all. That's a slip stitch. So moving forward, we want stitch number 3 on each square. There. I'm going to pass it through. It reminds me, if any of you are knitters, it reminds me of binding off. You're passing sort of one stitch over the other, except in this case you're dragging one stitch under the other. So we just keep slip stitching the stitches together all the way down, trying to match them. And truth be told, if you miss a stitch on one side or the other, it's not going to be a whole lot of skin off your nose. Unless you're doing something for the state fair or something. I don't know. I guess then it kind of needs to be good and perfect. But it can be good and folky, just like this. Okay, so we're getting close to the end, and all that's left now is our corner stitch again, which we can see is there. So corner stitch. Now we need to skewer the back corner stitch too. Yarning over, bringing that through, sealing up that last loop there. And to finish up, you can cut it a nice generous tail and pull it all the way through to finish. And there's what we look like. Oh my God, it's so pretty, you guys. Okay, so at this point, if you're creating a larger piece that uses a lot of granny squares, I like to wait until the very end, after all the squares are together, before I start trimming my ends or weaving them in. Because sometimes when you have granny squares sort of corner to corner, if you had two more right here to sort of form a foursome, sometimes where the corners meet, there's a little bit of gabbage happening, and not in a good way. So what I like to do is sometimes use these ends to sort of, I will take either a crochet hook or my fingers, or yikes, even a tapestry needle if I gotta, and loop it through that little loop just to close it up, and then I weave in the end. It's just a little quality control thing. But otherwise, once you have your ends all closed up, it's really easy to just sort of either tuck these in with your fingers. You want to do it at least 3 times. So like sort of just weave it through 1, 2. You can even weave it back on itself, which is something I tend to do. Yeah, so like 1, 2, 3, and then nib it close to the work. And then it's done. And you're done with sewing 2 granny squares together. Great job!